Boker Tov, everyone. Now, in the past number of weeks, we've been looking at these incredibly intimate, often painful moments between the different members of really our family. And many rabbis have said, including Rabbi Tzvi Grummet, who God willing will be our guest speaker for an in-person Shabbaton at the end of May, in his beautiful book on the book of Genesis, on Breshit, he talks about how the beginning of Breshit is really the story of a family. That family expands ultimately into a tribe, into a nation, ultimately Israel. But right now we're looking at a family. And one of the things that we often see in families is there are individual members of the family who often get more attention than anyone else. And one of the challenges we get is we have these powerful, powerful moments with individual characters, and we feel for them, but then it moves on right away because it's not necessarily the most important thing in the story. Now, tradition tells us that every single thing included in the Torah, no matter how small, every moment in the Torah is included because it has something powerful to tell us. But this week, we look at this moment of Rivka, when she is pregnant with her two sons. She doesn't know that, she's about to find out. And she has this incredibly powerful, painful, almost existential emotional struggle. And then the Torah just moves on because that's not what's important. What's important are the two sons in her belly and what's going to become of them. But what we're going to do today is we're going to put a freeze frame on that story, on that moment, which the rabbis did take seriously. And there's some beautiful commentaries that we will read today. But in some ways, virtually everything I saw ultimately took a moment to note Rivka's suffering and then move on from there. So the background to this is that as we saw last week at Yitzchak, who was lost his mother, he lost that guiding feminine voice in his life, and he found Rivka, a strong, beautiful woman who a lot of rabbis, not necessarily feminists, but a lot of rabbis sense her individuality, sense her independence. But one of the common tropes in the Torah is these incredible women who are unable to have children. Now, that's something that women today indeed struggle with. Some are able to overcome it, some are never able to. So it's an incredibly sympathetic, powerful, and real thing, women who can't have children. And what happens in each of the incidents is that either the woman or the husband or both pray to God, and God blesses them in an almost miraculous manner. And then that child or those children then go on to do great things, as if to say, not only is it because of God that you're able to have children, but because God blessed you with a child, now you kind of owe something towards God, or your children owe something towards God. Rivka is in one of those moments. She is barren, or believes she is, but then God opens her womb and she becomes pregnant. But her pregnancy is not typical. There's something going on within her that's painful, and we'll see the language in just a moment. And her response to that suffering is, again, it's so powerful, and it uses this phrase that it's really difficult to understand. And the rabbis, again, they take that moment, but then they move on and say, but Rivka's not what's really important here. What's really important here is the children that are going to come out of her, Yaakov and Esau. And that's what's really important to the Torah. Well, today we are making a stand and saying, no, Rivka is just as important, in some ways even more important. And one of our last sources, the second to last one, is going to look at that challenge that Rivka has, is maybe Rivka should have been more important to the story. Why was she not? And that could have been part of her struggle. So Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And the first source here, it's right after Rivka, or it's actually in very, very short sources. It talks about her being unable to have children and Yitzchak praying on her behalf, and then it follows from there. So please, Gloria, source number one from our Parasha of Toldot, which means it's connected to the word to give birth, and it's the word that means generation, meaning these are all the children that came from so on and so forth. And a lot of Breshit is this person begat this person, begat this person. So Gloria, please.
Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and the Lord responded to his plea, and his wife Rebekah conceived. But the children struggled in her womb, and she said, "If so, why do I exist?" She went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord answered her, "Two nations are in your womb, two separate peoples shall issue from your body. One people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger."
Now that incredibly so the older one is Esav, and usually the one that comes, even though they're twins, Esav comes out first with Yaakov from the word Ekev, heel, grabbing on behind. Usually the older, inherits the family, inherits the legacy, leads the tribe. But we know from many times in the Torah, it's not about age, it's about who deserves it more. And Yaakov is meant to be the inheritor of our people, and he gives birth to, or he is the father of all the tribes, leads to our nation. But there's a single moment in here from the barrenness of Rivka and Yitzchak and his power to be able to pray to God and God blessing her and giving her a miracle to be able to have a child, and then moving on to the prophecy, which is where most people spend their time. But there's a small phrase, 3 words. That's it in the Hebrew. If we look here on the right, let me see if I can highlight it. Yeah, here it is. Just 3 little words where while she feels this struggle, vayit rotzetsu, and the rabbis will talk about that word. It's from the word ratz to rana, but she senses something is not normal. What's going inside? Now she's never had children, so I myself have never had children or have never given birth, so I don't know what feels normal. So what she felt may have been actually atypical, or it may have been just scary for her, which it can be for a woman who's pregnant for the first time. But in that suffering or in that unusual feeling, she asked this question, Lama ze anochi? The word lama meaning why, ze meaning this or that, and anochi is a fancy way of saying I. The beginning of the 10 commandments, the Aseret Hadibrot, when Hashem is introducing Hashem's self, Hashem says, Anochi Hashem. And most people do not, or most humans do not say Anochi. So the question is, how is it being used here? And the grammarians of the rabbis, the Medaktikim, do indeed discuss why is Anochi used here. Because some rabbis like to drash on it and say that it's an acronym that stands for, a fancy name of God, but that's not appropriate here. So it must just be a very high poetic way of emphasizing the I in this place. It's not just, oh, I'm going to the store, but something fundamental about who I am and my identity. It's not just I am doing something. This is about me and who I am. Lama ze anochi. So most people translate it by adding in words that are not there. Why is this happening to me? Or they translate it here, so why do I exist? And the translations often reflect the interpretations that we're going to see in this class. But Rivka has this moment, and then she goes to God and says, help me, I don't know what's going on. And God says, this is why you're suffering, because you have twins. Except those twins hate each other, and it's going to create one of the great conflicts, that's going to go on pretty much forever, at least for thousands and thousands of years. Small comfort to a woman who's suffering. So we're going to focus on that moment of suffering and what's going on in her head. So the first place that we're going to go in, Isabel, I'm going to unmute you and see, you did get it worked out. So this first source here, Ramban Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, 13th century Spain, again, he had the benefit of having access to the great Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, and even Ezra and other rabbis before him. So one of the best things that he does is he helps summarize and explain the opinions of the earlier generation, and then he brings in his own personal opinion. So he's going to start with the Rashi and mention the Ibn Ezra as well. So it'll be an opportunity to see their opinions on this Lama Ze Anochi. So Isabel, please. And she said,
if it be so, Lama Ze Anochi, if the pregnancy is so great, Lama Ze Anochi, why did I pray for and aspire to pregnancy? Thus, Rashi.
Pause there for a moment. So that's Rashi's opinion. Rashi appears to say quite simply, when she says Lama Ze Anochi, it's not this great existential crisis. It's more of pregnancy is really difficult. Why did I pray for this? And again, having not been pregnant myself, I cannot speak other than perhaps from a sense of empathy. But, a wife and a mother and other people who've gone through pregnancy, I know that it is challenging. Some women, it's not as difficult, but some, they can have a lot of side effects, or it can be deep discomfort, or there can be a lot of pain associated with it, whether it be morning sickness, etc. And it is very human for a woman overjoyed as she is that she's going to bring life into the world, especially if she's desired children and been struggling. Sometimes when she's caught up in that physical and perhaps psychological suffering, she might ask herself, what, was this a mistake? Why did I do this? What was wrong with me? And then hopefully, as she feels better and has the children, she gets over that. But Rashi says this is just a totally human thing. Now, did he experience that from his own wife? And she had said something similar to that. So this is a very human, reasonable interpretation of what might have been going on there. But the rabbis, including Ramban himself here, push back on that. So he continues, but it is not correct. Please, Isabel.
But it is not correct. For the word Anochi, I, according to Rashi, implies I prayed for pregnancy. And this, comments Rambam, is not correct.
So just a quick thing, because he doesn't spell that out. So what he's saying is that technically what Rashi is saying is Rivka is saying, why did I ask for this? Well, she didn't ask for this. Her husband Yitzchak, and it's clear in the verses, he's the one who asked for it. Now, I don't think I would throw out Rashi's comment out of hand. Just because she wasn't the actual one who pleaded with God, it's very safe to assume that she did desire this, that she went to her husband and said, I want children too, that he didn't just pray without, asking her, informing her. So I wouldn't reject Rashi outright. However, Ramban does not like Rashi's answer on a very technical point. How can you say, why did I pray for this? You're not the one who prayed for it. Fair enough. Now Ramban continues on, and he goes to the Avraham Ibn Ezra, also a Spanish rabbi. Please, Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra.
Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra said that she asked the women if they had experienced such pains. And they said no, whereupon she said, if the matter and custom of pregnancy be as they said, why am I beset with this unusual pregnancy? Now, according to this exposition, the verse is missing and not complete. Her inquiring of other women as to their experiences with pregnancy is not even mentioned explicitly, although it is central to the thought expressed in the verse, according to Ibn Ezra.
So pause here. So there's a few interesting things here. So what Ibn Ezra is suggesting is that this question, Lama ze anochi, is not why did I ask for this, but she's going around to other women and saying, why is this happening to me? Did it happen to you? Because she's obviously has access to other women who have had children and saying, is this normal in pregnancy? Now, Ramban's rejection, and again, that's a very human thing. And again, I know from my wife being pregnant, she absolutely wished she asked her mother or my mother or her friends and said, I have this feeling. What did you do? How did you deal with this morning sickness? Or asking her doctor, is this typical, et cetera? Women do that, totally normal. And it's a very human understanding of it. And again, it shows perhaps a sensitivity of Ibn Ezra. Maybe he went to his wife and said, tell me about pregnancy. I don't understand what's going on here. I don't know if that happened, but that would be a beautiful and cool moment. And Ramban says that's lovely, except the text doesn't imply that at all. There would be more words, there would be more, there'd be more going on there. Now, the rabbis often have interpretations based on words that are not there. And what Ramban does, interestingly here, he says, it doesn't say that, but it makes a lot of sense. Why did he say Ibn Ezra made sense, but Rashi didn't? I don't know. Maybe the Ibn Ezra made a little bit more sense to him. Regardless, both Rashi and Ibn Ezra are talking about a very human experience of her physical suffering and really just feeling awful about it and saying, is this typical? Oh yeah, I wish I wasn't pregnant. I don't want to go through this. But Ramban is going to posit a much stronger and third interpretation that sort of comes out of left field. So Isabel, please, the correct interpretation.
The correct interpretation, in my opinion, is that she said, if it shall be so with me, why am I in the world? Would that I did not exist, or that I should die or never have come into existence.
Now, there's a lot to unpack here, and in some ways we're going to come back to this because this is it's almost a suicidal ideation. She doesn't want to exist anymore. There's a couple things here. First of all, this isn't so far off from the Rashi. Rashi Rashi's interpretation is not that she doesn't want to exist, but she just wished she wasn't pregnant. But it's kind of an extreme response to what she's going through. And Ramban's interpretation here is as extreme as it gets. If this is the kind of suffering I have to look forward to, I wish that I didn't exist. Rashi's, which again is a little extreme, is much more reasonable. There are women who want the children, but they just don't want to suffer for it. And here she's saying, Lama ze anochi, why am I still in this world? Now, part of this could be, I don't know if anachronistic is the right word, because part of this interpretation comes from the idea that she realizes, or she knows, that what's going on in her womb is the birth of two nations that will basically forever be at each other's necks. And she does not want that to be her legacy. She doesn't want to give birth to enemies that are, that Yaakov is going to away, Asaph is going to come after him. Yes, they'll make peace, but ultimately their descendants, so Jewish tradition goes, are going to be enemies forever. And she doesn't want to be part of that. So again, she could have just had Rashi's interpretation, which is, I wish I wasn't giving birth to these children. But she's so terrified of what she's going to bring into the world that she wishes that she just didn't exist. I wish I wasn't here. I wish I wasn't a part of this story. This is not the role I want to play in the story. Very powerful. We'll come back to that, except she didn't know that until after she spoke to God. She says this question, Lama ze anochi, before she knows that she has twins. So Ramban's interpretation here has a lot of assumptions in it. Not inherently wrong, but I don't think as strong as Rashi's and Ibn Ezra. And I think the fact that Ramban, not the fact, but when Ramban rejects them, I don't know if he really thinks they're that wrong. I think he just thinks he's more right and is just trying to push them aside so he can give his own incorrect interpretation. But so far, what we've seen here is an incredibly human and vulnerable moment from Rivka. And again, as a male, I cannot speak to going through that. I've seen my wife go through that. Thank God it was not nearly as bad as many, many, many other women have gone through, but it's painful and it's scary. And no matter how much love a woman, or for a woman who does want to have the children, sometimes that pain is pretty overwhelming. So before we go on to the next rabbis who try and approach this in a different way, are there any questions, thoughts, or comments up till here? Yes, Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, which is perfect because I will have you read next. And Irv, welcome. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, sorry,
please.
I was a little late.
No, perfect time.
It just seems from a biological point of view that women and children died a lot in those days. So it was a scary thing to have to be pregnant and to have children. So, and the fact it's not mentioned here, but just having twins was different than having a single birth.
Yes.
So it may have been physically much scarier. She didn't know she was having twins at that point. And then the physical manifestations of having twins in her womb may have been somewhat different from the experiences of the other women. And that might have been what was really scary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jane, stay unmuted, but Susan, you have your hand up. Oh, Susan, you're already unmuted. Go for it.
Yeah. Well, a couple things. So I would translate this as why me? But I think it also might go back to the previous story where she was chosen as the woman who was going to marry Yitzhak. And it was, it's not like she saw this guy and thought, oh, he's kind of cute, I'd like to marry him. But it was kind of an arranged marriage in a way. And she was picked out by somebody else before she even saw the guy. So she might have been thinking, why did all of this, going back to the previous story, why is this all happening to me?
I think that's an excellent interpretation. The last source we're going to look at, which is a contemporary one, I didn't bring the paragraph before it starts, but it really talks about that, about how Rivka's life was in many ways kind of decided for her. And, she's having an opportunity now to kind of push back on that and say, why was I chosen for this? And fine, okay, I was chosen, maybe I can accept that, but now I have to suffer for it. And then when she gets through the physically painful and survives it, as Jane pointed out, pregnancy, the suffering doesn't go over. She has to use deception to make sure that the right son that God wants to become the inheritor of the family tribe, and then see her children fall apart, and so much pain that she has to go through. And that's, again, this one question of Lama ze anochi could just be that she has horrible morning sickness, or it could be, again, more existential in her realizing, I am part of a story of just suffering and horrible things, and I don't want to be part of it. Yes, in many ways there's a happy ending, but in many ways there's not. Although there is a beautiful reconciliation for Yaakov and Esav, what it takes to get there could just destroy a person's soul. And Rivka, she straight up talks to God, which means essentially she's a prophetess, which means that she's brilliant and able to recognize things in the world. She knows what's going on. She is not a passive member, part of the story, which is why I wanted to make sure today that we didn't let her be passive. You can see here the rabbis don't brush her aside completely, but she's rarely the hero of her own story. So I wanted to let her be so. So Jane, if you could go ahead and source number 3, again, one of my favorite rabbis, Or HaChaim, Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar, 18th century Morocco. Not only does he try and get to the pshat, which again doesn't mean literal transliteration, it means the most likely understanding of text in context. Don't bring in midrash. He also likes to bring in educational messages. It's not just what does this mean, but what is it trying to teach us and tell us? So Jane, please source number 3.
Well, it says in the Hebrew side, Vayit Rotzitzu, and on the English side, Vayit Ratzitzu. I don't know which one it is.
Oh, interesting. Let's actually clarify it right now. We'll look at the text up top. Oh,
Vayit Rotzitzu. I see it. I see why.
Well, it's something called Ktav Maleh and Ktav Chaser, which is,
so
there are 2 ways to spell it. So it must be that whoever the translator was just wrote the without the Vav in there, but it's
Vayit Rotzitzu habanim b'kirba. The children were quarreling inside her, etc. Both the expression Vayit Rotzitzu, they quarreled, and the words Lama ze anochi, why am I therefore, need examination. Rashi explains that if the pain involved in giving birth is so intense, why did I bother to pray to become pregnant? It is difficult to reconcile our image of the pious and righteous Rebecca with Rashi's comment, i.e., that she did not think the pain was worth her while in order to become a mother. Also, if that had been her real concern, how did God's response alleviate her problem?
So again, this is a rejection of Rashi. And again, Rashi's understanding is a very reasonable human one, but Or HaChaim starts out by saying, but Rivka is stronger than that. And the rest of the story doesn't seem consistent, that she would just be saying, oh, this pregnancy is too hard. So he continues on.
Our rabbis have offered many and various explanations, none of which are acceptable as the plain meaning of the verse. The plain meaning of the word Vayit Rotzitzu is based on the root ratzatz, to crush. Since there were 2 fetuses in her womb, she felt as if her womb was being crushed. She was afraid that she could not complete her pregnancy and would have a miscarriage as a result. Her question then was rhetorical, i.e., what good was my becoming pregnant if this pregnancy will not be completed successfully? The words "she went to ask God" mean that she prayed to God to let her complete her pregnancy without mishap. She felt that the miracle of her becoming pregnant after all these years surely should not be wasted by her not giving birth to a healthy child.
So first of all, I think this might be what you were getting at, Jane, about her fear about why am I pregnant if I'm going to end up having a miscarriage. So again, it takes a different direction there. It's not that she's mad that she's pregnant. It's that she's mad that the pregnancy that she prayed for, this miraculous pregnancy, may not come to term. So why did I get pregnant and be blessed by God that my husband had to talk to if it's not even going to turn into anything? Why go through all this suffering if I'm not going to have children? Which goes with the consistent thing that we will actually see in the next source as well, which is that, yes, Rivka has been put in a very challenging, both physical, emotional, even political situation. Despite that, she is an incredibly strong woman, and she wants to have a family. She is a righteous woman who wants to bring holy men and ultimately women into the world. She would not shy away from a challenge. That's the version of Rivka that the Or HaChaim and our next source see as well. And she's frustrated that for all that she's ready to go through, it may be for naught. So now we've sort of seen 3 different variations on it. The first 2 are, I guess, 4 different variations. 2 of them are just that she wishes she wasn't pregnant, this horrible suffering. And then Ramban's, which is she just wished she didn't exist at all. And now we have Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar's, which is she's glad she's pregnant. She just doesn't want it to be a waste of a pregnancy and all the physical suffering that she's going through. So any questions before we go on to the next source? Excellent. Okay, so Irv, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So this next source, really cool, the Kedushat Levi, commentary on the Torah by Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, 18th century Poland, and his teacher was the Maggid of Mezrich. Now, if you haven't heard of the Maggid of Mezrich, you probably heard of his teacher, who was the Baal Shem Tov. So we are now in essentially third generation of the great founders of Hasidism. So this work is a Hasidic commentary, which means that it brings in a lot of Kabbalistic mystical ideas. Now, I don't believe he really digs deeply into the whole mystical, like the Sfirot and the different aspects of Kabbalistic ideas. But what he does dig into is the idea that Rivka is this incredible woman, and she knows she's incredible, and she knows that she has an important part in history to play. And her frustration, similar to the Orach Chaim, is not that she wishes she wasn't pregnant, but she's almost frustrated that she has to go through this suffering and she can't do more. Why am I suffering so much, but I may not be able to fulfill the great role that I really am set out to do? Not as a matter of ego, but of a recognition of her purpose in the world. So Irv, if you will please take source number 4.
Genesis 25:22, she said, "If so, that the children already quarrel within my womb, what is the purpose of my existence?"
Pause there for a moment before we go on. I just want to point again that already this is subverting or just inverting the order. She asked that question, what's the purpose of my existence? Why am I? Before she knows that she has twins quarreling in her room. So the Kedushat Levi is making a little bit of a jump there for midrashic purposes. I just want us to be, aware that he's doing that, because his explanation is already based on, not a correct interpretation. She would not have asked that question, or she wouldn't have gone to, what God told her was new information that she had twins. So it doesn't make sense. But regardless of that, continue on. We can understand.
We can understand this complaint of Rivka on the basis of a comment by the Arizal that righteous women are spared the pain and discomfort of pregnancy. Rivka, while experiencing even more than the normal amount of pain and discomfort during her pregnancy, had concluded that this was proof that God had not considered her righteous. Moreover, it is tenet of our faith that if someone is not a good person, such a person will not serve as a receptacle for anything holy or potentially holy. Our sages have based this insight on Leviticus 11:15, and every subspecies of raven, each according to its species, is forbidden to eat. The word
Kol
in that verse means that even close association with something ritually unclean, i.e. a raven, is an obstacle to such a person hosting Holy Spirit, so forth. According to Bereshit Rabbah 63:6, whenever Rivka passed a Torah academy, Yaakov would make an effort to leave her womb, whereas when she passed a pagan temple, Esau would try to leave her womb. Thereupon she went to ask God about this strange phenomenon. The Midrash states further that the word
Zeh
in our verse refers to the fact that originally, if not for her complaint, Rivka was slated to become the mother of all the 12 tribes. Seeing that she appeared to find fault with God's arrangement, she was told that she would become the mother of only 2 sons, one of whom would be Esau. One of the sages in the Midrash takes issue with the literal meaning of Yaakov and Esau, respectively having shown awareness of when their mother passed a Torah academy or a pagan temple, and states that, of course, this is merely a simile, and that Rivka consulted with the heads of the academy founded by Shem and subsequently headed by his great-grandson Eber. According to another opinion offered, Rivka knew that the source of holiness is the one known as
Anochi.
and when she exclaimed, Lama
Ze Anochi,
she expressed her confusion how she could be the receptacle of a son who clearly strived for holiness if she was not worthy. On the other hand, if she were worthy, then why did she experience such a difficult pregnancy? God put her mind at rest, telling her that her difficulties did not mean that she was not worthy, but that the other son, who would be unworthy, was the one that caused her present problems.
Thank you. So there's a lot going on here, a lot of anachronism and a lot of midrash here, but essentially breaking it down. There was, at some point in history, this Jewish belief that if a woman was truly righteous, she would have an easy pregnancy. We're not going to, I'm not going to validate that. That's just a belief. It's, whatever their custom was. But within this bubble where that is true, that a woman who is righteous and worthy of having great children would not suffer. Well, she's suffering. So therefore, she can't give birth to worthy children. And because of that, then she's saying, but then she finds out that one of her children will be worthy. So she's saying, what's going on here, God? This is essentially the end of his of this discussion, is saying, God, why am I giving, how is it that I'm suffering, which means I'm not worthy, so my kids will be a bunch of duds. You're telling me one of my kids is going to be a great and holy person. So the response is, one will be great, the other one will be unworthy, and because of Esau, essentially, which again is looking forward to Esau becoming a villain in the story, which he's not, and we had talked about that last year, how he becomes a villain because of what he comes to represent. Regardless, because of Esau, you're suffering. So there's a lot there to take in and be challenged by and say, I don't really like that, but we can see how this rabbi, Kedushat Levi, is trying to understand why Rivka is having this fundamental existential crisis. Women suffer through pregnancy. Now, we've seen decent interpretations of why she's frustrated. She's frustrated because she thinks it's not worth it, or because it is worth it, and she's afraid that she's going through it for nothing. But here in this Hasidic thing, where righteous men and women are beyond nature, she shouldn't have to suffer. But if she is suffering, what can it mean? So they unpack it here at the end. The other thing he pulls out in the middle here is this very famous midrash about what are they fighting about, which is that Yaakov, who's going to be this holy, righteous rabbi, and the rabbis do this all the time anachronistically. What do we call Moshe? We don't just call him Moshe or Moses, we call him Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe our rabbi. You don't find that anywhere in the Torah. Who calls him Moses our rabbi? The rabbis. The rabbis always put the forefathers and foremothers in the context of rabbinic tradition, that Avraham was learning in yeshiva and he was studying the Shulchan Aruch. There's this famous comment by I believe Rashi, who says that all of the rabbis kept the entire Torah. They were keeping, Chalav Yisrael, and they were checking their food products for the OU and everything like that. We're not going to unpack that now. That's simply part of the rabbinic project of giving rabbinic meaning and holding up the rabbinic class by seeing it within the words of the Torah. But again, here what they do is say Yaakov is going to be a great rabbi and he wants to learn in yeshiva. Esav wants to be an idol worshiper. So when they're in the belly, if she walks by a yeshiva, and again, there's an assumption here that there were yeshivas all over the place, that you had WITS here and YCT over here, but you also had the Greek pagan temple over there, and each baby was trying to pull her mommy's belly in a different direction. So we're not going to take that literally. And in fact, Kedushat Levi even brings a source in the Midrash who says don't take that literal. So I love that he does that. But again, the takeaway here is, again, why would Rivka ask such a fundamental existential question? And if you pile on all of the midrashic things and all of the assumptions of these Hasidic masters and these Kabbalists, then you get to this idea, which is, what was Rivka's concern? The fact that she was suffering meant that her children wouldn't be anything special, and she was suffering for nothing. And God said, no, you're having twins. So maybe Rivka thought she was having one child who would be a dud. God said, you're having two kids. One will be incredible. One is going to be a dud. And a dud meaning a horrible, monstrous villain, which again, Esav was not, but it becomes that. So before we go on to our final source, any questions up until now? Excellent. So this last source here is one that we haven't brought in before. And part of that is just because it's a text that's not easily available to me. So Aviva Zornberg, who I believe might have come out to Milwaukee a number of years ago to speak, I'm seeing head nods. And one of the things that she does is she brings a lot of psychology, which in some ways we've seen Rashi and Ibn Ezra sort of bring that in, not necessarily psychology, but trying to understand the human and the humanity in that moment and giving Rivka her due, which Aviva Zornberg in her work tries to give to everyone to understand everything in a greater context, what was going on inside of people's heads and their interrelationships. Now, Aviva Zornberg is brilliant and beautiful. Do I understand everything she says? Not necessarily, but I thought it was very important to allow the last word, as it were, of this class to be given to a woman who can understand this much better than I can. She doesn't necessarily say, as a woman who's experienced the pains of birth, here's what I think is going on, but I imagine she has a sensitivity that I lack. So one of the things I said, the reason I don't bring her is nothing about Aviva Zornberg. It's just that I don't have her book. And I got this from Google Books online. I happened to find a page that discussed it. And I said, this is cool. Let's bring it in and see if it can add something to the conversation. So she says in her book, Beginning of Desire, Reflections on Genesis. Most striking in this vein, however, is her enigmatic cry, meaning Rivka, as the infant struggle in her womb. If so, why do I exist? So that's how she translates it, which again, Susan, is not so different from the why me. It has what she means by that can differ. But I like your translation, I think, the best, Susan. The why question here too is a bare, rudimentary 3-word riddle. Lama ze anochi. Why this I am, if you translate it literally as I started. Rashi amplifies the question, why did I desire and pray for pregnancy if the pain is so great? Perhaps Rashi is responding to the anochi, the I am, as the unitary sense of identity, tormented by the conflict of her pregnant state. Ramban finds Rashi's amplification not sufficiently grounded in the words of the text. Instead, he emphasizes the central importance of the word anochi. If this is to be my fate, why am I in the world? I wish that I were not, that I would die, or never have had being. As Job said, better had I been as though I never was. And there are other scholars who do connect Job's looking at his suffering and say, why did I even exist? Just to go through this to what happens to Rivka now. Ramban reads Rebecca's question as a radical challenge to being. Rebecca, as Job, stripped the I am consciousness of all value. Such a nihilistic meaning there's no point to anything in the world. There's just no meaning to anything. All is meaningless. Nihilistic protest at the pain and conflict that the self must endure is, for Ramban, the first urge to prayer. So she makes a shift here, and turns this not into pure suffering, but as a crying out to God. God, I can't make sense of the world. I don't know my place in it. I don't know my purpose. God, why? Why me? As Susan said so beautifully. And then what does she immediately do? She went to inquire of the Lord. But Maharal, this is the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Loh, who did not make, but was famous for supposedly of making the golem. But Maharal, responding to Ramban's reading, expresses some dismay at its existential skepticism. He's very taken aback by Ramban's suggestion that Rivka is saying, why do I even exist? He suggests a modulated translation of Anochi. Why then am I sitting passively? He uses the Hebrew word batel, which means to nullify or cancel something out. Like if I have a giant pot of meat soup and a single drop of Parmesan cheese falls in there, it's so tiny it becomes passive, insignificant, and it's still kosher. Why do I not investigate? It is my task to seek out explanations, and she went to seek God. So Maharal says here, not that Rivka is asking, why do I even exist? There's no point to anything, but rather this moment of, I don't understand. There's something happening to me that I don't understand. So what could I do? I could sit back and be a passive, nullified, unimportant part of my story, or I can get up and go to the writer of all stories, to God, and say, God, explain this to me. Job does that. It takes Job, you have a long time to do that, but at some point Job says, enough of this. God, what in your name are you doing? Why are you making me suffer? Avraham does his wisdom. God, I love you. You're incredible. But what are you doing? You can't just destroy an entire town. Moshe does this after the sin of the golden calf. God, I'd rather you kill me, erase me from the Torah than destroy the people here. These are people saying to God, explain it to me. Can you help me understand what's going on here? I'm not just going to sit back and take it. And this understanding of both Maharal and Aviva Zornberg's bringing of it makes Rivka very powerful. Not as why is me, but I'm going to understand what's going on. What is going on? God? And she calls God to task. In Maharal's reading, Rebecca confronts the despair of the self and discovers that the question of meeting has a dynamic force. Her despair is not to circle hollowly upon itself, but to launch searchings and researchings, inquiries for God. For Ramban, angst, this suffering that she has, and we validate that it's human, sends Rebecca into an encounter with God. For Maharal, the questioning itself is a mode of quest. So she actually, Aviva Zornberg here, both validates Ramban and Maharal that the ending both leads to God, but it's about what's more important. Is it about the angst, the I'm suffering, God help me with the suffering? Whereas, you know what, there's some huge questions here. And I think this is a valid opportunity, a powerful opportunity to talk to God. But the important thing that connects all of this, that Aviva Zornberg brings in, is that Rivka is not just a footnote. She is not a receptacle to bring on the next generation, a transition that will give birth to the next important player in the story. She matters. She, as I said, she's a prophetess. She can talk to God. She has the chutzpah to talk to God and say, God, you made me pregnant. What's going on here? And God's response is essentially, thank you for asking, and explains it to her. Whether or not the answer is comforting, that doesn't matter. But God validates her question and sees her as an important part of the story. And her story is not done here. She has a big role to play in the life of Yaakov and the future of our people. But Rivka should not be written off as, oh, she was suffering, she felt horrible and said, woe is me. She was a powerful person who stood up to God and said, God, you chose me. You put me in this position. Tell me why. Tell me it's worth it. And God responded with, I will speak to you. And when we talk about what can we learn from it, it's that even in our greatest suffering, no matter how bad things are, we have every right not to go to God and accuse God, but to ask God why. Whether we'll get a response like Rivka or just the feeling of release of knowing that God will listen to our challenges, does care about us suffering, and does want us to understand what we are going through. That is Rivka, the hero of our story.